All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org or scotthortonshow.com. I've got more than 6,000 interviews in the archive for you there going back to 2003. And follow me on all the video sites and X at Scott Horton Show. Okay, guys, on the line, I've got good old Kyle Anzalone. He is our news editor at the Institute, libertarianinstitute.org, and he is our opinion editor at antiwar.com. That's antiwar.com. Also, he has two great podcasts. One of them is called Conflicts of Interest, and the other is called The Kyle Anzalone Show, and they're both really great. Welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Doing great, Scott. Thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. Happy to have you here. So there's like some sort of kind of bright side stuff in terms of international diplomacy and negotiation type things going on. At least it's not all negative news. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Can we start with Ukraine and what's the news with people talking on the telephone and agreements to talk on telephones further?
Yeah, and Scott, just kind of following off of your comments there, I think what it is there's reason, at least there's some news to be optimistic about, where the Biden administration was just ideologically opposed to diplomacy at all, but particularly with Russia, to now have the Trump administration at times floating the potential of and making a priority ending the war in Ukraine certainly seems like a step in the right direction. And so this led Trump to having two calls yesterday, well, multiple calls, but two major calls yesterday. And the most important being with Vladimir Putin. And he said after that call that they had agreed to a number of steps, and it all sounded kind of vague. And it did seem that the Russian side had put in order a priority, ending the war and having an agreement to end the war ahead of a ceasefire, but movement towards a ceasefire and talks with Ukraine about ending the war, including floating the idea of having the Vatican host talks between Putin and Zelensky, which I think could be, something major and could lead to some breakthroughs, although there are still major divides between the two sides.
Well, tell me about that.
Well, I think territory is the biggest one, Scott, where Russia is saying that we have annexed these 4 Ukrainian territories plus the Crimean Peninsula, and part of ending this war is going to be the recognition of those territories as Russia. I think, the Russians see this as important for a few reasons, including the Western sanctions on Russia, a lot of those originating from the annexation of Crimea. And so removing those sanctions and recognizing this territory as Russian is a part of what Russia wants to end this conflict. On the Ukrainian side, they're saying they're not willing to cede any territory at all. And if that's the case, then, we're very far apart here. Now, Russia only controls, I would say, a half to 2/3 of the territory that they've annexed. And this includes, the Donbass and the 2 southern oblasts of Ukraine. So, Russia is asking for a lot more than they actually control on the battlefield. But the problem for the Ukrainians is on the battlefield, the Russians are winning. Their movements, they may be taking territory very slowly, and maybe, I don't know what cost is coming at as far as money and how many young men they're losing. Trump keeps citing this number of 5,000 Ukrainians and Russians dying a day. I have no idea if that's true or what the proportions would
I think he said
be.
Per week, right?
Per week. Yeah. But what how that would break down between the two sides every day. So, but I'm sure this is coming at a pretty large cost for Russia to take this territory. And the Russian side, after the Istanbul talks, said, if Ukraine won't accept a deal now, then we're going to ask for more later.
Right. Now, so let's talk a little bit about the casualties, because I guess my position has been that we just don't know, that both sides play up the other side's casualties and play down their own. And that it seems like the Russians, since they're in most cases on the offensive, typically that means that they got to lose more guys because they're the ones getting out of their trench and moving forward, exposing themselves in ways that defenders don't have to. On the other hand, the Russians are dropping a hell of a lot more bombs from the air, and they are firing far more artillery shells and have been this whole time. And obviously have the Ukrainians completely outgunned. And so I don't know. And then I just tend toward, when we're talking about actual combat deaths, not just excess deaths in the country due to deprivation or whatever, but actual combat deaths, which is almost all of them here because the civilians have been able to flee in most cases. I mean, there are still thousands of dead civilians, but not tens of thousands, I don't think. But I tend to just go with, when we're talking about direct combat deaths, I tend to go with the most conservative kind of estimates around, but I don't even really know what they are anymore. I just know kind of what sounds high to me, and but I don't claim to be the definitive expert on that or anything. But and I know people who kind of choose sides on this definitely have their opinions set. But I wonder what you think about all that.
I really haven't been able to put anything together, Scott. I think Trump at the beginning of his administration said there were a million dead in the war, but I don't think he's repeated that number very often. So I have no idea if that is true or not, if that's a number that Trump made up, or even where he might have heard that from. I know like both sides kind of claim their number of dead is in the tens of thousands and the opposition number of dead is in the hundreds of thousands. But obviously you're not going to believe Kiev here because they're putting out war propaganda to their own population, and the same with Moscow, right? You want to make it look like your side is winning. Now, even though the Russians are on the offensive, Scott, I think it's pretty clear that their goal is to wear down and maybe eventually cause the collapse of the Ukrainian military versus actually taking territory, which may be one difference in the explanation for why Russia isn't losing as many men as a typical army, or let's say what the Ukrainian army lost when they were trying to conduct their offensive in the summer of what was that, 2023.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So if the Russian goal is to more wear down the Ukrainian military, and they seem to be relying on a lot of bombs, they're using essentially a Russian version of the JDAM now, converting older bombs into guided munitions. They got a lot of artillery. Obviously, drone warfare has become a big thing on each side of this conflict. And if the Russians are just digging in and softening up the Ukrainians until they could fairly safely take territory. Obviously, this is warfare. Nothing is safe. The Russians are taking losses. And look, Ukrainian drones are getting through and hitting Russian cities all the time. This is happening. It seems maybe a little bit less over the past couple of weeks, but they were almost daily drone attacks deep inside Russian territory for a time near the end of the Biden administration, and even at the beginning of the Trump administration. So
Yeah.
Russia is losing a lot here, but it does seem like their goal is to go slow enough. I think Michael Vallejos has put out some pretty good estimates on this, although I don't remember what they are on the top of my head. But I thought his reasoning and how he totaled them up sounded pretty reasonable.
Mhm.
We ran
And
that article at antiwar.com a couple weeks ago.
okay, now he wrote that for us, or that was at TAC or what?
I believe he wrote it for the Realist Review. He's writing with James Carden
Oh, okay, great.
there. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. I'll definitely take a look at that. And now, as far as the drone thing, they says, well, these are domestically, supplied drones. Ukraine has developed this advanced drone industry, and then later they admitted that, oh yeah, no, the CIA built it for them. So that's again Americans. It's been a little while since we discussed how absolutely ridiculously dangerous this war is. That America's
Right.
helping Ukraine kill Russians inside Russia, in some cases civilians, operating at, whatever infrastructure targets that they're hitting, trains and fuel depots and whatever factories and the rest. So it's it's highly important that Trump is working this hard to bring it to an end. I sure appreciate that part of it. But now, so
Well, Scott, can I just comment on that real quick?
yeah,
Because this week there's a lot of talk. The main talk in like the corporate media is about Biden's health and his mental fitness when he was in the White House. And we have several reports now of not just Biden saying we were the closest to nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia since the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also estimates that the U.S. intelligence community thought there was a 50% chance that Russia could nuke Ukraine. And now, it's coming out and becoming very clear that Biden was not mentally, and everybody who was watching knew it. But now that the corporate press is admitting it, I think they we need to bring up and really demand answers that you are not only having somebody who was mentally feeble as president, but also walking up to nuclear red lines with Russia as he was doing it, and who exactly, was holding on to the nuclear football. If Biden woke up in the middle of the night and decided he wanted to nuke somebody because he was scared, I mean, could somebody stop him? Like, these are real
No.
questions that nobody was asking.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the national security advisor could just wrestle him to the ground, take the phone away from him or something, but certainly no one would have the authority to stop him. The whole
Well, I
system
mean, the
is
concern there
designed
is
to go at the word of the president. Otherwise, it's not a sufficient deterrent if it's not that easy to use. See? So,
right. And who can you imagine a weaker national security advisor to stop the president from doing so, even physically? But, would Jade Sullivan just step in line and follow orders? He seems like the kind of guy that would.
yeah, who knows? Um, yeah, especially if it's a crisis he created, can't admit that. Um, so the other thing is that you mentioned that's important here is the Russian strategy. And, I'm no military strategist, but I talk with Danny Davis a lot, and he sure says what you say, that clearly what they're trying to do is just grind the Ukrainian military down. One day they'll break it, then they'll be able to walk around wherever they want, or that's been their plan or their tactics and a method of reserving forces and not just wasting their men. However, that means that as time goes on, back to what you were saying earlier in the show, they haven't consolidated their control over this territory, and they haven't broken the Ukrainian military yet. And now they have Donald Trump from the United States of America's gotten elected and come into power and is trying to get them to stop the war before they've accomplished what they've set out to accomplish, which means that, as you put it, there's this huge gap, including literally on the ground, between what Russia demands and what they've got and what they would have to require of the Ukrainians. We're going to need you guys to withdraw a few hundred miles here, and here. Give us, all of Kherson on the other side of the river too. Give us all of Zaporozhye, even though we only control 2/3 of it now. Bakhmut, the Donbass, Donetsk, three quarters or something like that. I think they control virtually all of Luhansk, but still, they only control, maybe half of Kherson and
Yeah.
2/3 of Zaporozhye. So then the Ukrainians are supposed to withdraw from that territory and then recognize it on its old, internal borders there as all Russian territory now. Yes, sir, and tip their hat. And, I don't think so. This is, if it comes down to just fighting a guerrilla insurgency, I'm sure they'll do that, but I don't think they're going to give in to those terms. So I think this is, if peace breaks out, it's a miracle, and I'll praise him. And Donald Trump, America is pretty powerful, and he does have some weight to throw around here, but it just seems impossible to get the Russians to back down from their goals, considering the momentum that they have now.
Well, Scott, I do think there are proposals that could be put forward, and the U.S. does have a lot of leverage here, right? Everybody who says that we want to negotiate with Ukraine or with Russia is accused of wanting to abandon Ukraine. But if you listen to people who, advocate for ending the war in Ukraine, they also advocate for things like not carrying out war games on Russia's borders, right? What if we agreed to roll back some of our troop presence in the Baltic states, ending NATO expansion, taking the Aegis Ashore systems out of Poland and Romania, agreeing to stop meddling in Georgia. There's a lot that the U.S. could promise Russia that I think could make Putin's goals in Ukraine a little bit less ambitious. I'm sure from Putin's perspective, leaving a larger Russian population in Ukraine might not be the worst thing if they could raid the elections just a little bit with more Russians there or something like that. So there may be arguments that you could make to Putin and things that the U.S. could give Russia, returning to the INF or the anti-ballistic missile treaty, agreeing to extend the New START treaty, that the U.S. could promise Russia that may lessen their maximalist demands that they have in Ukraine right now.
Yeah. Hey, that'd be a good surprise for the New York Times. Donald Trump signs START 2. He says he doesn't care that Bill Clinton threw it out years ago. We're going to go ahead and go the extra mile here. Um, Now, as far as leaving enough Russians in Ukraine to make a difference, I mean, that ship has sailed, I think. That's the whole thing here. And that's, people say, well, I don't know, whatever. They say lots of things. I think it made a lot of sense for the Russians to leave the Donbass and all of South and Eastern Ukraine inside Ukraine because their guys typically won, or at least people, from the East. That's where the majority of the population is from, is the East of the country. And, predominantly Russian culture, if not ethnicity. And so that was why America had to rig the elections all over and over again. So, or worse, right? Um,
Right, but a lot of Ukrainians have left the country who would
that's true.
vote for the other side of that election too. And if, like I said, there would probably be some rigging involved here. But what if Moscow demanded a new part of the Ukrainian constitution was you had to be present in Ukraine, or maybe even in the former regions controlled by Russia to vote? Or there's certainly ways where he could rig this up that he could get a Russian friendly government in Kiev and leave Russians behind and use those numbers.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly has redrawn the border in a way to remove the bulk of them already. But I see what you mean. Like in Lebanon, they have a deal where, and I'm going to get this wrong. It's just an example, but like the president has to be a Christian and the House Speaker has to be a Shiite and the Senate Majority Leader has to be a Sunni and whatever like that.
Yeah,
So
that's
there
the
are ways to,
constitution we wrote for Iraq.
yeah. Um, Yeah, no, you make a lot of good points and you list a lot of American transgressions that could simply be rolled back. I talk about in the book how when Putin said, listen, I demand that you guys respect your promises of 1997 to not move military equipment into the new NATO countries. And they all scoffed like this was the craziest thing they'd ever heard. 1997? Why, that's back in the 20th century. Like it's the 17th century or something. Um, when Bill Clinton's right there, you could ask him about it. But as he said, yeah, and that's the deal until we wake up one morning and decide to change our mind. He's quoted by his friends saying that. Michael McFaul is the one quoted him saying that. So, mocking the Russians for believing him, basically. But yeah, we could just go by the earlier promises.
And
Yeah.
and maybe one last point on this, Scott, and I think there is like kind of an end date on this kind of deal, especially because there's 200 to 300 billion dollars in Russian assets that's frozen in Western accounts. And Western governments are increasingly starting to take those assets, sometimes in response to Russia seizing Western assets that were left behind in Russia, and then also to give money to Ukraine. And so if they start to go too deeply into those funds, Russia getting that money back is likely going to be a condition to ending this war. And so the more Europe takes that money, the harder it's going to be to end the war.
Yeah. Um, well, yeah. So, can you talk a little bit more about catch me up on England and France and Germany and Poland, for that matter, and their recent stances on all this?
Yeah, as far as I could tell, the Europeans still largely seem to be on board, although they've rolled out ideas like these major $800 billion spending, military spending for the entire continent, reducing and removing caps that countries could have on their debt to GDP ratio in order to hit their defense spending goals. And some of this weaponry is going to go to preparing for a European war with Russia. Some of that money is going to be weapons that are sent to Ukraine. But if you look at the numbers, and they can't even commit to this, it's still not enough compared to what the Biden administration was throwing at Ukraine. And so I do think, we're coming to a point here, maybe in the next year, Scott, where there's going to have to be a real decision by Western governments. How much are they willing to give Ukraine, and how far in debt are they willing to go to continue to support this war? I mean, we've already seen it's at times reduced American weapon stockpiles to their red line levels. I think they've ramped up some production, but they're still not giving Ukraine everything they need. There's no chance that Ukraine is going to turn around and go on an offensive here. And of course, the Ukrainians are eventually going to be short of men. But that aside, just how much can the West support Ukraine does seem to be limited, and eventually they're going to have to deal with that reality. And I think that time is coming soon.
Yeah. All right. So Israel, Palestine. No. Other sort of kind of good news. Talks with Iran. Tell me some good stuff there.
Well, Scott, the good news is that the talks are still going on. And this is something that Ted Snyder has pointed out, and he's one of our really good writers at both the Institute and antiwar.com. And he's pointed this out in a couple of recent articles that publicly the Trump administration is saying that Iran has to completely give up its nuclear enrichment program. And Iran has said several times that that's a red line. And yet the Iranians keep going back to the table and keep engaging in talks with the US. And so Ted's saying the good news is maybe the messaging that we're getting publicly, because certainly even publicly we've heard from some administration officials who have said that they're willing to let Iran enrich and basically go back to the 2015 JCPOA. They haven't said that, but those parameters where Iran would have a very strictly inspected nuclear program and be able to enrich uranium to a low level. But also publicly, the Trump administration is saying that they're not going to be able to have a nuclear enrichment program at all, but that Iran is saying that the talks are sometimes a step in the right direction. Seems to me that they can't be saying that behind closed doors. And so who are they lying to, the public or the Iranians, is the question.
Yeah. Hopefully the public.
Right. Well, there would be reason to, just because of how anti-Iran the U.S. Congress is. Trump could certainly not want to give the Congress time to start passing resolutions and bills that would undermine, because they could say that you can't lift sanctions if Iran has a nuclear enrichment program or something like that, and kill any deal Trump would make. So it could be kind of political tactics here that he's going for. Although I'm not sure that Trump is that competent to pull something like that off.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I mean, he would already, if he wants a deal with the Ayatollah, he's going to have to give in on some enrichment. They talked about this international consortium deal. Maybe that'll be a good enough compromise to get them, working with the other nearby countries on it or something. But the Ayatollah is just going to not give in on that. I can't imagine what kind of threats combined with promises it would take to get him to give up on enrichment. There's just no way. And then, so if Trump is going to make a deal with him on that basis, then he's going to have a huge fight on his hands, no different than Obama did in 2015. And especially when it comes to Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham and them, he's going to have to raise his voice and shout them down like in the meanest kind of way if he's going to get his way to get a deal through. And I don't know. Public opinion might be with it, but Congress is operated out of Tel Aviv.
Right. And I think that's the big point. As much as I'm skeptical that Netanyahu actually wants to go to war, or even the U.S. to go to war with Iran, I certainly don't think he wants the U.S. to make a deal with Iran, because that is a big part of the Israeli propaganda as to why the U.S. just needs to give Israel unlimited amount of weaponry and remain engaged in the Middle East, even though we've had president after president run on getting America out of the Middle East and ending these wars. We always get stuck there because we can't leave, because we have to protect Israel, because the Iranians are going to get a nuclear weapon and kill them all.
Yeah. Hey, y'all, if you run a business or a side hustle and want to keep more of your money out of the IRS's hands, Matthew Cersoli, the Agorist tax advisor, is your guy. He'll help you set up your business the right way, find every legal deduction, and keep the feds off your back without you ever needing to talk to the IRS yourself. Unlike most tax pros, Matthew actually hates the IRS and calls it a win-win when you get to keep your money and the government gets less. That's my kind of tax guy. Check him out at agoristtaxadvice.com/Scott to get your free Agorist tax toolkit. That's agoristaxadvice.com/Scott.
Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education.
Hey, y'all, here's how you can support those who support this show and stay awake while you're doing things. Moondo's Artisan Coffees, moondosartisancoffees.com. Get it? Starbucks supports the war party. Moondo's is with us. And it's really good. Get the Scott Horton Show blend. Just click the link in the right-hand margin at scotthorton.org. All right, well, I don't know. I was looking at this thing, this guy, Omer Bartov, was saying that the Israelis' killing of the Palestinians is genocide. And I thought, hey, don't I know that name? And also, who the hell is this guy to say that? And then I remembered that, oh yeah, Omer Bartov. I read him because he's the Holocaust scholar who I read a bunch of stuff by him about what happened in Ukraine during World War II when I was researching for my book, Provoked. Oh yeah, Omer Bartov, the Israeli-born Holocaust scholar, compares what's happening in the Gaza Strip right now at the hands of the Likud government of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli government, to, I don't know, I guess his direct comparisons to Nazi Germany, but still he's calling it a genocide. So there's one good authoritative voice on that. I read a thing the other day where they had all of these genocide scholars, I don't know exactly what it takes to be one, but from all around the world saying, well, yeah. And I'm not sure if they're just reading the statements of the Israeli finance minister on a daily basis the way you are and the way I am, or what exactly their basis is. They're seeing all the killing, and but it's the intent. And there's so many of these blatant statements, almost unbelievable that they continue to talk this way about their intent to eradicate the people, the Palestinian people of the Gaza Strip. So I was just wondering if, I don't know, man, people getting bored of this. It's kind of out of the news cycle, but the ceasefire is long over. There's a full scale, re-invasion going on right now. And so can you please just catch us all up on the worst thing the United States of America is doing right now, please?
Yeah, I mean, the situation there, Scott, is absolutely horrific. And Israel has ramped up their operations. They have a new military operation called Gideon's Chariots. And Netanyahu has said they're going to destroy Gaza and make it unlivable. And he thinks already that 50% of the Palestinian population of Gaza is so desperate that they're willing to leave. Now, just from statements from Palestinians, that doesn't seem true. However, I feel like I have seen, and this is just kind of my anecdotal experience from looking through my ads feed, more Palestinians basically saying like, you can't do it anymore, right? Like the children are starving to death. Aid hasn't entered Gaza since March, I believe, 3rd. And during that period, now they have said they're going to allow a basic amount of aid in, and I think they allowed 5 trucks in. And so that's a population of 2 million, maybe a little less, Palestinians in Gaza at this point, who are supposed to eat from 5 truckloads, right? Not even enough to stock your local Walmart. So obviously the amount of aid that they're sending in is insufficient. And the Israelis have been pretty explicit that one, their plans is to allow this aid into these areas where they're going to have an American security contractor checking everyone as they come in. They're going to be sectioning off the males from the rest of the people that way. And then they're going to feed the women and the children, but they're going to do it in an area where they could be easily driven out of Gaza. Now, where they're going to go, I think, is the last remaining issue that's preventing this genocide from just being carried out. And over the course of the Trump administration, we've had several reports now that Tel Aviv and Washington have approached Syria, Somalia, Puntland, Somaliland, Sudan, and Libya about taking in the Palestinians. Now, all these countries seem to have something in common, Scott. They're, countries in the midst of either civil wars or autonomous regions or countries that are really looking for international recognition. And so I think Washington has a lot to offer these countries, especially if they're able to pit maybe opposing forces against each other, like in Libya. If they offer the Tripoli or the Benghazi side intelligence and some military support, that could easily be enough to tip the ongoing civil war there and help one side or the other emerge as victors. Same thing in Sudan. International recognition for Puntland or Somaliland would be absolutely huge. So the Trump administration has a lot of carrots to throw out for these different governments or regions to take in the Palestinians. And of course, if you get 4 or 5, 6 of them on board, and it turns out that the population of Gaza is already diminished to 1.8. Trump at the beginning of his administration was saying like 1.8 million. Then you're talking about 300,000 or so people for each of these countries to take in. There could be a lot of money and incentives thrown their way to do it.
Yeah. So this is how it's been this whole time. I mean, this is how the Nakba happened too. They just killed a bunch of people, and then they says, "Hey, look, a land without people for a people without land, because we just killed them." And that's what they're doing here. And it's amazing to hear them say, I don't know why it's amazing. It kind of is. To hear Bezalel Smotrich say, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate them all down there in the south of the country near the border in these couple of regions. We need their populations to be concentrated together, he says. I don't... it's funny. I don't know. Maybe it's just funny for how few people notice in such a 4 and 5G world of 8 billion people that like, wait, did you just say concentration camp? I think he just said we're going to put them in a concentration camp. They're already in a concentration camp. This is more like a death camp, but Anyway, yeah, and so Donald Trump's stance so far is, oh yeah, no, go right ahead, right? I read the other day there's been no pressure to deal.
Right. There's been some reports that Trump is upset with Netanyahu, and the best evidence of this is that Trump didn't go to Israel during his trip around the Middle East, and JD Vance was supposed to go to Israel and cancel that trip. And so who knows if there's maybe like a personal issue between Trump and Netanyahu at this point. Trump apparently didn't want Netanyahu to move forward with the military invasion, and I think the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the children starving to death, at least 50 or so of them since March 2nd at this point. Those are just the documented ones. All of these images of these kids that are, just nothing on their bones. It's absolutely horrific to look at. Probably put something of a cast a real shadow over his first foreign trip to the Middle East, and that was supposed to be a big deal. And so he could be a little bit upset with Netanyahu, but the Trump administration has made clear there's no divides between Washington and Tel Aviv, and it's just maybe a matter of personality and not policy.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that article on antiwar.com where Trump denies there's any beef here. Well, I take him on his word at that. Horton's Law, they mean what they say when it's something horrible. So,
right, and it seems like it would be very Trumpian tactic, Scott, that if Trump really was trying to move or push Netanyahu to say, oh, Israel, love the Israeli people. Netanyahu, he's a tough guy right now, got to deal with that tough guy. He would have said something to indicate that, yeah, I'm not exactly happy with Netanyahu. That's how Trump operates.
right. Yeah. And there was no indication of that at all. Although, it did seem substantive that he made a deal with the Houthis that didn't include the Israelis, you know.
Yeah, no,
That wasn't
that was
nothing.
interesting.
Although they may have just had an agreement about that, who knows? There's no reason to think that was really over Netanyahu's dead body or anything. Just, hey, you're going to have to handle this. I've given as much as I'm going to, and that was the deal. Doesn't mean that they had a fight about it necessarily.
Right. And from the American side, it could have been at least in part about logistics. Could they get enough aircraft and bombs and bombers and things over to keep up at the pace that they were bombing Yemen? I think the Yemenis claim it was closer to 2,000, but the Americans say it was about 1,000 airstrikes over the course of 6 or 8 weeks. So that's a massive bombing campaign that they were attempting to carry out there. Also having to dodge and try to shoot down the Houthi missile and drones. It had to be incredibly expensive. And again, I'm sure logistically difficult to have that many military assets, that many bombs in a region when, of course, we're doing everything to build up in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and helping Israel in the Middle East.
Yeah. Man, so I forgot which picture it was. It was one of the stories on antiwar.com yesterday with the picture of all the children and, well, everybody else too with their plate, begging for a little bit of food at the thing and just a mob crush. And this poor little girl, I think, in the picture has just gotten a little bit and is trying to get the hell out of there. And they're not fighting over it, right? Nobody's like stealing each other's food or anything like that. It's not that chaotic, but it's otherwise, it's a chaotic mob to get their plate to the front. People are absolutely starving. Their children are starving. And they're trying to get that food back to somebody else behind them, And
Yeah.
just a look of absolute misery and terror on this little girl's face. She's, 10 or 11 years old or something, this picture. And, this isn't really emphasized enough that this is America's war just as much as it's Israel's war. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are pure partners with the prime minister in this. There's just no question about that. They get all their weapons from us. They're flying American planes, dropping American bombs, using American intelligence and support in unknowable ways. Tens of billions of dollars in extra aid to help pay for it all. I mean, what can you say? And yet, what American interest is served in this whatsoever? What do the people of Gaza ever do to us? Nothing. And what are we going to get out of this other than terrorist attacks? Somebody says, oh, well, they're going to end up stealing all that natural gas, but they can steal that natural gas anyway. Have to murder all these people. They've already been conquered. They don't have any rights anyway. They're not even allowed to fish more than 3 miles off their own damn coast.
Right. Were they going to develop those natural gas fields or stop the Israelis from doing it when they can't even go fishing without the Israelis' permission? I mean, that was just absurd. And, another part of the American presence, Scott, we talk a lot about the bombs and the bombers, is the D9 bulldozers, too, where they are just flattening Gaza. There's a really, I mean, it's horrific, but really good reporting in 972 magazine about how they are just day after day after day, sometimes with robotic, sometimes with manned D9 bulldozers, just thousands and thousands of homes. One of the soldiers said you could look over where Rafah was and it's just flat land now. They're just going through every single house, just tearing everything to ground, bringing it to the ground. They took a corridor, the Nazarene corridor. They cut it across the Gaza Strip. Everything about 2 kilometers wide just got absolutely flattened by the Israelis. And this is making it absolutely unlivable. There will be nowhere for these people to return to. And of course, they're not going to allow in concrete, rebar, steel, all the pipes, the copper, the wiring that you would need to rebuild these structures. And so even if the Palestinians try to hold out and stay, Scott, they're going to be in their tents. And another point to how much this is an American war, I saw a report not that long ago from a U.S. mainstream outlet where they're just documenting the prevalence of the casings from bombs and other U.S. weaponries that now litter Gaza Gaza. It's to the point where they actually will use some of these casings because it's the only thing metal or strong plastic that they could use to prop up their tents left in Gaza. And so I'm sure they're reminded every single minute of every single day that these horrors are brought to them. Yeah, sure, from the Israelis, but with American weaponry.
Yeah, I found that it's our own Rappaport, who I'm familiar with him from doing previous good journalism, render it unusable. Israel's mission of total urban destruction at 972mag.com from just the other day, May 15th. Did we run this as a spotlight or we're going to? Oh, it's the spotlight today. There we go. Of course. Oh, man. You know, nobody ever says this, and I didn't get a chance. I was on the Pierce Morgan show yesterday, and I didn't have a chance to, I tried to just squeeze it in at the end. But all of this, not to be selfish about it, but to try to appeal to other people's selfishness, all of this is a security risk to the United States of America. Ron Paul is absolutely right. We can't just go around the world doing these things to people and think that there's not going to be repercussions. Our government is putting our people in peril, as he put it. And that's exactly right. And it doesn't mean that any one person listening to this is in any significant, percentage increase of danger to their own life. But is this country in greater danger of being attacked? Yes. And you know what? I'm so busy on so many projects, Kyle. Keep your eye out for this for me, if you would. And listeners, too, if you can. Who knows what the guy said while he was driving to New Orleans to do the New Year's attack? He's a former Army soldier convert to Islam. Not even a Tajik who snuck across the border, an American veteran convert who then goes to New Orleans and ran down and killed how many people, Kyle? Do you remember? I don't even know.
I don't
such
remember.
A terrible person. I don't even know how many people died in that thing. He killed a bunch of people, man. More than 12, I think it was. And it's only luck, see, that the way it happened was he crashed and there just happened to be like 6 cops standing right where he crashed into, I think, a bulldozer or something, some heavy equipment. And so he opened the door of his truck with a gun in his hand and they just blew him away. Which, good. But I'm just saying that was only happenstance. He could have driven past them by another little bit, or he could have stopped a quarter mile before and killed far more people. He could have had 2 or 3 friends with him. And we'd still be talking about this thing every day, all the people they killed that day. And, especially they knew what they were doing, covering their flanks and this and that tactics and whatever. And yet, as far as I know, they haven't released those videos or even talked about what's in those videos other than he made all these ranting videos about his motive on the way there. Details, please. I guarantee you it's about Gaza. I could be wrong. I admit I'm just speculating that. But I'm just saying, come on. That's what drove this guy mad. And then what happened? He killed a bunch of people having fun on New Year's Eve on Bourbon Street, man. That's the price we have to pay for Israel's sins. And I'm only 99.9% sure I'm right about that, but we'll see.
Right. Well, Scott, to commit a genocide in Gaza is unbelievable, but to do it at the same time as you embrace the jihadist government of Syria is just the stupidest policy that Washington has ever moved forward with. That Trump is calling Jolani, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, an attractive guy, a tough fighter with a tough past. I mean, this is absolutely absurd. I'm not for sanctions on any country, but the idea that we would embrace the Syrian government in this way after decades of rejection of the Assad government is so stupid. And while doing it, while fueling the genocide in Gaza is bound to increase the amount of blowback the Americans are going to face for these policies.
Yeah, you almost want to give him a George W. Bush excuse, right? That he just must be too ignorant to know that this guy killed Americans in Mosul and Ramadi and brags about it.
Well, wasn't this the point of Tulsi Gabbard being in the administration, where at least she was going to know who the terrorists were, who the jihadists were, and who the real enemies of the American people were? I didn't expect her to, maybe not advocate for war against the Houthis or something like that, but at least to not support and actively embrace the actual terrorists. That's insane.
Yeah. I don't know. She must have done a briefing where she explained who this guy is. I mean, I got to admit, they're in a terrible position. I mean, as you just said, you don't want sanctions. I don't want sanctions on them. I sure as hell don't want a war against them. But it is a bin Ladenite state. And if they really tone down the bin Ladenite-ism, then there's going to be another revolution, So, I mean, and they're surrounded by friends. They got the Turks and the Israelis who like them. Their only enemy is Hezbollah in their west, and they're no threat. Not right now, they're not. Not without Iran and the Syrian Arab Army, which no longer exists as their allies. And so, what are you going to do with Al-Qaeda in Syria if you're Donald Trump and Joe Biden stuck you with this before you're inaugurated? You ain't going to kiss the guy's ass, talk about how handsome he is.
Right.
But he could have, and I don't think we need to normalize relations with him. I couldn't bear to if it was me. And in fact, if it wasn't me, but if I was Trump, I would say to Erdogan, I don't like this guy. Get me a guy in there who's less worse than him. Not worse, less worse. This is crazy. This guy swore his loyalty to Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi at the height of Iraq War II. Mm-hmm. How could anything mitigate that? There's nothing that mitigates that.
Right. It's astounding, Scott. And again, just maybe the dumbest policy I've ever seen Washington move forward with. And look, this is bipartisan. The Biden administration would have done, if Harris had won the election, I guarantee you the same thing would have happened.
No, he'd be sitting in the Oval Office having a nice meeting there. Man, that's
maybe
dissatisfied with our foreign policy. Really, is what I am. I have to say. I don't know. I feel like there's something left unsaid about Gaza right now. I mean, there's whatever. It's just such a horror show. And as far as I can tell, I don't see an end in sight here. As you said, they're just launching this whole new thing. Trump doesn't seem to give a damn. And so what's going to break other than just Palestinian bodies? They're just going to keep bombing tents. They're going to finish this thing and nobody's going to stop them.
Yeah. There's one more interesting detail in that 972 article that we were talking about earlier, Scott, that's running as the spotlight at antiwar.com. And that is Israel has, at the first couple of weeks of the campaign, they were bombing at a very high pace, but that has slowed down a little bit. And part of it is Israel has apparently found it cheaper to pack old armored personnel carriers in particular, but other old military vehicles full of explosives and put them under remote control and then drive them to the target that they want to blow up.
Are you kidding?
I guess most of the time these are abandoned structures, or at least structures where the Israelis told the Palestinians to leave first, but they are doing this.
The IDF is using VBIDs, whatever, vehicle-borne IEDs.
Yes.
All right, well, that's Kyle Anzalone, everybody. That's why we keep him around. News editor at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org, and opinion editor at antiwar.com. And you got to subscribe to his great YouTube and podcast shows, and it's on X and all the different distribution platforms for you there. The Kyle Anzalone Show and Conflicts of Interest. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for listening to The Scott Horton Show, which can be heard on APS Radio News at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, and the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.